It's Christmas Eve. You're having dinner with your family in the house that has been in your family for generations. You inherited it not long ago, and you plan to pass it down to your kids at some point. The fire is crackling quietly, and the house smells exactly like it always has at Christmas since you were a kid. Suddenly, your front door flies open, and 4 men with guns walk in and announce they own the house now. You have 30 minutes to grab whatever you can and leave. So I know what you're thinking. Huh? That would never happen here. I would call the cops. But what if those people are the cops? What do you do then? Imagine living in a country where anyone can bang down your door, kick you out onto the street, and steal the property that you have worked so hard to own. The equivalent of a bully taking your lunch money with no repercussions at all. Can you imagine how anxious you would feel? This is Jeff Grana with GPS Realty coming at you with another shot of honest guidance. One of the foundations of a thriving civilized society are strong property laws. We in the U.S. are lucky to have generally strong property laws, although we're not the strongest, believe it or not. We are not even in the top 10. We'll talk about that later. I thought it'd be cool to commemorate President's Day, which is always celebrated on the third Monday of February every year, by doing a little video to give you some background on who the most important U.S. presidents have been with regard to real estate. So the most important parts of real estate actually originated at the very beginning of our country. It should be no surprise that the most consequential president with regard to real estate was George Washington. This all started in 1791 with the Bill of Rights, which laid down the bedrock for our country. Specifically, in this case, the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. Now, when people think of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, what's the first thing they think of? Actually, most of the time, it's the right to not incriminate yourself, which is to hear people say, I plead the Fifth. But wrapped up in there is the Due Process Clause, which says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. And also included in that is the Property Takings Clause. Think of eminent domain, which says that the government cannot take your property unless just compensation is offered. So, George Washington and the First Congress kicked everything off in 1791. Things largely went unchanged for the next 72 years until January 1st, 1863, when President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation took effect. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery, but when it took effect on January 1st, freed slaves were finally able to buy land that was sold at auction. As you know, President Lincoln was assassinated on April 15th, 1865, and was succeeded directly by President Andrew Johnson. The very next year, during Andrew Johnson's first term, he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which grants full citizenship rights to all males in the U.S., regardless of race, and guarantees all U.S. citizens the right to inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, or convey real and personal property. In practice, of course, it would be a whole different story for the next century and a half. This was a little bit disingenuous, actually. In fact, just a couple of months earlier, still in 1865, Andrew Johnson returned land given to the former slaves. Think about the 40 acres and a mule situation, thanks to General Sherman. He returned all that land to the white Southerners. So was he really an ally? So after that, again, we had a period, almost a century, of relative quiet. It was 96 years later, in 1962, when President John F. Kennedy issued an executive order that prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin in any federally owned, operated, or assisted housing. That laid the foundation for those policies to spread across all of the rest of residential housing in the United States. A couple of years later, on April 11th, 1968, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act just 1 week after Martin Luther King's assassination on April 4th. This was a giant piece of legislation because it included the Fair Housing Act that still governs all of the real estate industry today. In fact, April is known as Fair Housing Month as a result of those events. So by now, the United States is starting to get its act together as far as what a civilized society should look like. A couple of years after that, in 1974, discrimination on the basis of sex was added to the Fair Housing Act as a prohibited activity when Gerald Ford signed the Housing and Community Development Act. President Ford, who remember assumed office when Richard Nixon resigned in the face of the Watergate scandal, signed the act just 2 weeks into his term on August 22nd, 1974. About a decade and a half went by. September 13th, 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Fair Housing Amendment Act of 1988 into law. This act adds handicap and familial status, which is families with children, to the list of protected classes under fair housing law. It also strengthened enforcement of fair housing law by making it easier for victims of discrimination to sue, and it stiffened penalties for those who discriminate. Things stay generally quiet until the next major piece of legislation, which happened on July 21st, 2010, under President Barack Obama. While still dealing with the fallout over the 2006-2008 housing crisis, Congress passed the major overhaul of the national financial system through the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. That act, among other things, established the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or the CFPB, which works in people's interests to prevent predatory lending practices. And it's also known as the Mortgage Reform and Anti-Predatory Lending Act. Now, each of these laws was created by a coalition of people in Congress and had to pass both houses of Congress before they would make it to the president's desk for signage. I don't want to diminish their roles, but this is President's Day, so we're going to focus on them. Additionally, I've left out several what we might call incremental improvements in the interest of time because there are hundreds of tiny tweaks to regulations here and there that have either strengthened or weakened ownership laws over time. But these are the real highlights. In large part, they illustrate how we got from where we started to today. It's really because of these laws that guys with guns, whether they're the government or the mob, cannot just barge into your house and claim it for their own. Now, we talked earlier about the strength of the United States property laws, but if you take a look at where we rank on the Property Rights Strength Index put out by theglobalEconomy.com, the U.S. comes in at number 25 out of 181 countries. The top 5, just for reference, are Singapore, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Finland, and the UK. And the lowest ranked 5 countries are countries like North Korea, Somalia, Turkmenistan, Haiti, and very last is Venezuela. Strong property laws are directly responsible for our ability as citizens to build wealth in this country. So for all its shortcomings and being a constant work in progress, take a second this President's Day to be grateful to those throughout our history who managed to make the United States a more stable place. That's all I've got for you today. This is Jeff Grana with GPS Realty, once again, bringing you another shot of honest guidance. Thanks, and have a great day.